Welcome you to GW. I'm Charlie Glazer. I teach here in the Elliott School and in the Department of Political Science, and I run the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies, which is co-sponsoring this event with the American Conservative, and the American Prospect. The Elliott School in particular, and GW more broadly, value work on policy-relevant topics and outreach to the broader policy community and the interested public. So we're very glad to have the opportunity for this collaboration. Today's event could not be better timed. It's hard to imagine even a year ago or 6 months ago that many of the topics that are going to be front and center on the agenda today would have been as prominent as they are now. If there was ever any doubt about the question about whether U.S. should use military force in a variety of mid or low-level conflict scenarios, those doubts have been largely removed. The situation in Ukraine, and then even more recently and urgently in Iraq, made clear that the United States is going to have to make difficult choices about the use of force. And while the underlying questions in those two cases are quite different, they share important similarities. The blurb that describes today's conference says a broad new foreign policy consensus is emerging that favors prudence, diplomacy, and the rule of law. I think it's a very good blurb. However, if you read the paper or the policy press or listen to the news, that consensus is not as well formed or not as well established as the blurb might suggest. And the events of the last few months make that clear. There's a very intense debate now about Iraq. The consensus, or so you might say the mainstream view is that we should do something, that we should use force. And of course, some people think that we shouldn't. And for those of you who haven't seen it yet, Barry Posen, who's going to speak later today, has a short and very interesting piece in Politico this morning making the case against. Disagreements about the proper role for military force in U.S. security and foreign policy underlie many of these issues, or define these issues, but there are many preceding questions. So let me just go through a few of these, which panels will talk about today. First, how large are U.S. interests in the various dangers and challenges the U.S. faces around the world? And related, what's the nature of these dangers? Is U.S. national security challenged, or is it instead, quote, just U.S. prosperity? But for many people, that's a key divide. Do we want to be using military force to protect U.S. prosperity? In Iraq, is the danger in Iraq that the flow of oil might be cut off if the conflict spreads, which makes it an economic interest but not a security interest? Is it a security interest because it might become a safe haven for terrorists? Or is it none of these? And if you look at the debate, these are questions that help define the debate, but the answers aren't easy. Another very important question that we'll hear some about today is how effective is force in eliminating the dangers? People have very different views about the potential effectiveness of limited force, even large amounts of force. And also, how effective are the alternatives, which is one of the topics the conference will focus on. Are diplomacy, economic development, and state building alternatives to the use of force? Are they complements? How effective will they be? And then for each of these, we have to look at the costs. How costly is the use of military force itself? What does it put at risk in terms of American lives, but also other lives? Is the use of force likely to be self-defeating? Will it lead to counter-mobilization? Or will it lead to splintering of groups and potential allies that undermine U.S. influence? Is state building just too expensive? U.S. efforts over the last couple decades at state building have turned out to be very, very expensive when they're in war zones. So today's panel are going to shed light on many of these questions and many others. And I think then to get to the answers about what the U.S. role should be, we have to put together those answers into a more complete set of discussions about grand strategy. So I'm going to keep my remarks brief. Once again, welcome, and thanks again to the co-sponsors. And now I welcome Daniel McCarthy from the American Conservative.
Well, thank you very much for those remarks, Charlie. And I should thank very much the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies here at George Washington University for helping us sponsor this conference, as well as our office mates and friends at the American Prospect. As you may know, the American Conservative magazine and the American Prospect magazine have actually been sharing office space for about a year and a half, and it's worked out very nicely. It's a good keeps us on our toes, keeps us thinking philosophically about what we believe in. I should also make a brief word of thanks to our friends at the Foundation for Middle East Peace for their support for this conference, and also for my colleague Maisie Allison, who has helped to organize everything today. As Charlie's remarks have brought to light, this is a season of crisis in the world, from Iraq to Ukraine, and in fact to many other hotspots around the world. It is also, as the foreign policy blogger and Harvard professor Stephen Walt has pointed out, the season for foreign policy conferences here in Washington, D.C. and in New York City. The Council on Foreign Relations just had their conference last week, and there's also been a conference by the Center for a New American Security in the past week as well. And as Walt has said, there seems to be a certain kind of one doesn't want to use the word incest, I guess, but there's a certain amount of uniformity that one finds in the perspectives that come from the foreign policy establishment. And these perspectives are not necessarily adequate to the crises of our time, to the overextension of our military forces, to the economic plight that our own country is facing. And indeed, one wonders whether the hawks and whether the advocates of a rather forceful grand strategy for the United States really even understand their own specialties, whether they really understand military power itself and its limitations. And certainly what we've seen in the past 10 years and what we're seeing right now in Iraq suggests that the use of force and the use of military power is not a panacea, and in fact is not simply something that sort of strong, competent people are capable of, working miracles with, but in fact is something that is often a resort of people who don't have more creative and more powerful strategies, more diplomatic and more commercial approaches to resolving conflicts around the world. So today's program is going to present a number of emerging perspectives in what I think is a new foreign policy consensus, a kind of counter-consensus to what you're hearing from the Washington, D.C. establishment. That in fact there are people on the left and people on the right, people in the center, academics, journalists, and many others who are fundamentally rethinking the foreign policy principles that the U.S. has been pursuing. And this has been true in regions across the world. It's been true of how we address East Asia. It's true of how we address the Middle East, certainly in terms of how we address Russia and Ukraine and Europe. This is really a moment, I think, of profound reorientation for the country and for our strategy, and indeed for our internal politics. I mean, you can look at, for example, what recently happened to the House Majority Leader in the past week or so, and see that there really is a profound change taking place in the country. And it's a change not just at the political level, but also, I think, at the policy level. And it's just now being worked out and just now being shaped and formed into what will be, I think, the policy of the 21st century. So our panelists today will be discussing that, and I should say a word in brief about the American Conservative magazine, which has been fighting to create this new sort of policy consensus in favor of restraint and realism for a decade now. The American Conservative magazine was born on the eve of the Iraq War in 2002, and it was created because there were already conservative minds who were thinking very critically about the foreign policy that was being pursued by George W. Bush. And one of the key things that the American Conservative has done over the past decade has been to stay on a course of principle and a course of criticism, regardless of which party is in power in the White House. Whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, whether it's George W. Bush or Barack Obama, the policies that have been pursued have often been destructive and distracting from the American national interest. The American Conservative and so many other outlets have been focusing on restoring us to a path that our founders would recognize as truly Republican. So with those opening remarks, we will be welcoming the panelists in just a moment. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming. Welcome to our conference on the new internationalism. I'd like to thank George Washington University and the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies for hosting this event, and thanks also to our co-sponsors, the American Conservative and the American Prospect. My name is Daniel Larison. I am a senior editor at the American Conservative, and I'll be moderating this morning's panel. This will be a discussion on threats and responses with a focus on how to manage threats without resorting to military action. We'll be addressing some of the following questions. What are the real threats to U.S. security and U.S. interests more generally? Which U.S. interests are truly vital and take priority? How should we best respond to the threats that do exist? How can the U.S. ensure long-term stability without having to resort to military action? And what will aid the U.S. in doing this, and what actions should the U.S. avoid? Each of the panelists will begin with some of his own remarks, and then we'll turn to panel discussion for the remaining time, with a little bit of time at the end for questions from the audience. Joining me today for the panel are William Lind, expert on military affairs and columnist for the American Conservative, seated opposite me on the end. Dan Drezner, professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and contributor to the Washington Post, and most recently the author of The System Worked: How the World Stopped Another Great Depression. And Matt Duss, policy analyst at the Center for American Progress, where his work focuses on U.S. national security policy in the Middle East, with a concentration on Iran and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And he's also a columnist for our co-sponsor, the American Prospect. To begin the conversation, I'll say a little bit about how we in America tend to discuss threats and our interests in foreign policy debates, and how we need to change this. Then I'll try to answer the questions I've just mentioned. In general, American foreign policy debates suffer from an overly expansive definition of U.S. interests that purports to find an American stake in virtually every crisis and conflict. And the interests that are supposed to be at stake are frequently and often wrongly taken to be of vital importance. The overall number of U.S. interests is exaggerated, and so is the significance of the interests involved. And that reinforces another unfortunate tendency to overstate real threats and to perceive threats to the U.S. that aren't there. The U.S. does face real threats from terrorism and nuclear proliferation, but these are either minor or manageable ones. However, the more manageable threats are, the more inclined we seem to be as a country to overrate them and overreact to them. The more grandiose and ambitious role that we imagine for the U.S. in the world, the more that we will be alarmed by crises and conflicts that have little or nothing to do with American or even Allied security. That means perceiving threats to the U.S. where none exists, and exaggerating the ones that do into existential threats. Senator John McCain was just the latest to indulge in this rhetorical overkill last week when he described the advance of ISIS forces in Iraq as an existential threat to the United States of America. As long as the U.S. considers itself to be global hegemon and sustainer of a global order, Americans will often be encouraged to conflate dangers limited to a particular region with dangers for the U.S. and the entire alliance system built up since World War II. But the U.S. and its allies are in reality far more secure than that. Threat inflation is a dangerous habit that needs to be broken. But there is an alternative to exaggerating threats and overreacting to them. It requires us to focus on the few truly vital interests that the U.S. has, such as the stability and security of Europe and that of our major allies in East Asia, and to distinguish them from peripheral concerns that don't require a substantial American commitment. It requires us to give priority to the threats that jeopardize our vital interests, instead of attempting to respond to each new conflict as if the U.S. had a huge stake in the outcome. We'll be hearing much more from Professor Barry Posen on the subject of his new book, Restraint, a little later this morning, but for now I'd like to quote from the preface of his book to give us an idea of what this foreign policy of restraint might look like in practice and how it would address threats to the United States. He writes, "The United States should focus on a small number of threats and approach those threats with subtlety and moderation. It should do that because the world is resistant to heavy-handed solutions. It can do that because the United States is economically and militarily strong, well-endowed and well-defended by nature, and possessed of an enormous ability to regenerate itself. Any effort to reorient U.S. foreign policy away from the current over-reliance on military action will have to include the rejection of preventive warfare. Preventive wars are the fruit of overestimating foreign threats, dismissing the role of deterrence, and overreacting to manageable threats as if they cannot be contained. Prevention makes sense as a policy only if one accepts that some governments cannot be deterred, but there is no reason to believe that such governments exist. The U.S. would also need to be extremely wary of calls to use force to intervene in internal conflicts in other countries, whether it is being asked to do this for ostensibly humanitarian reasons or for some other purpose. While the U.S. has proven itself very capable at toppling or defeating regimes that it attacks, it has demonstrated that its military isn't suited for and shouldn't be used for nation and state-building missions. If the U.S. isn't able or prepared to stabilize the countries affected by its military interventions, it should have no part in further destabilizing them in the first place. One thing that the U.S. can very easily do to contribute to international stability is not to undermine it through ill-conceived and unnecessary wars for regime change. Neither should it indulge allies or clients that wish to destabilize their regional rivals. I'll suggest two other possibilities for what the U.S. can do to promote long-term stability before turning things over to Matt. The first is to minimize tensions with the other major powers in order to reduce the chances of a return to great power conflicts. One of the greatest dangers to long-term international stability and peace is the resumption of that kind of great power conflict that caused so much devastation and death in the previous century. Armed conflict between great powers would not only be severely harmful to all countries involved and to the global economy, but it also has within it the potential, however remote, of nuclear war. To reduce the chances of this, the U.S. ought to avoid pursuing premature or unnecessary policies of containment directed against any other major power. And it should focus on those aspects of their relationships where there is potential for better ties and improved cooperation with these states. Another possibility is to invest more resources and attention into efforts to mediate and prevent conflicts before they escalate into major crises. That might involve submitting outstanding disputes to international arbitration or offering direct U.S. mediation for frozen conflicts or political crises that have the potential to turn violent. In order to be perceived as a neutral mediator, the U.S. can't be actively backing or subsidizing any of the parties to a conflict. Appeals for military intervention are frequently successful because they seem to provide a quick response to armed conflict that other methods, diplomacy, economic sanctions, coordination through international institutions, necessarily can't have. That is all the more reason why a foreign policy that seeks to find non-military solutions to respond to threats should make a more consistent effort to diffuse crises before they deteriorate into open warfare. And it should refuse to encourage and promote sudden political change that adds to conditions for instability and conflict. It follows from this what the U.S. should not do. The U.S. should get out of the business of regime change, whether through direct intervention, arming insurgents, or encouraging popular uprisings. In recognition that sudden changes in government or the complete collapse of regimes produce tremendous instability throughout the affected region. The U.S. should generally avoid military action when it is not strictly necessary for the security of the U.S. and its treaty allies. That doesn't mean fighting a war just because one or two allies wants the U.S. to do this, and it definitely doesn't mean taking sides in another country's conflict because an ally or client would prefer us to do so. The U.S. shouldn't extend vague or half-hearted commitments to would-be clients that can be interpreted as promises of military aid or direct involvement. And it shouldn't be willing to ignore its basic obligations under international law for the sake of affirming nebulous values or norms. We shouldn't enable what Professor Posen calls reckless driving, which the U.S. does when it provides uncritical and unconditional support to clients that behave in an unduly aggressive or undesirable way towards their neighbors or the people under their control. And we should discourage our allies from treating our security guarantees as an opportunity to take provocative actions towards their neighbors that could potentially trigger hostilities that would draw us into new conflicts. As Professor Posen notes in his book, restraint is not a panacea, and it will not eliminate the need to resort to military action in certain cases. However, it is much less expensive and more sustainable politically, and it is a less destabilizing approach to foreign policy that would contribute to maintaining peace and security in the decades to come. Thank you. We'll now continue with some remarks from Matt Duss.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks so much to the American Conservative and the American Prospect for putting this on, including me. It's a real privilege to be part of this event. All of the panelists and participants with whom I'm very familiar, some with whom I'm personal friends. So I was asked to address America's role in the Middle East post-Iraq and Afghanistan, the negotiations with Iran, with the goal of the conference being thinking about ways to, or of this panel thinking about ways of maintaining stability without military action, with methods other than war. I'd say in light of the reopened, apparently, Iraq debate of the past week, I did not plan to have to come here and kind of restate that one of the best ways to maintain stability in the Middle East is not to start dumb, destabilizing wars. But I think apparently that needs to be repeated, and I guess will continue to be repeated.
How do you spell destabilizing?
I think it's on Google. Yeah. So rather than kind of take a more abstract approach, I think what as I was thinking through this, just looking at the way the Obama administration has handled the Middle East, and I think, I and others would have some criticisms about the way they've handled a number of things, but I'd say let's look at the Afghanistan and the Iraq, where the Iraq withdrawal, first of all, very much based, and this is really, really important for the administration, is basing this in legitimacy, both in terms of domestic support. This is something this administration is very, very conscious of constantly, it seems to me, but also in terms of international legitimacy. What John Kerry referred to as the global test and was widely mocked, but guess what? I think he was correct. That we are stronger when we act within what's seen as an international consensus. Now there's a whole range of questions of how one establishes or cultivates or understands that consensus. But I think the understanding internationally was that occupation should end. The United States should withdraw from Iraq. It was certainly democratically supported by the Iraqis themselves and overwhelmingly supported by the American people. Just speaking as a progressive, I think this sense of legitimacy is possibly, a defining characteristic of the way that progressives understand foreign policy. I'm thinking of a quote from Josh Marshall, of Talking Points memo back in the early days of the Iraq War, where he said legitimacy is one of the ultimate force multipliers, that we're going to be able to achieve our goals much better to the extent that we're able to bring allies along and be seen as acting in a legitimate, fair, and appropriate fashion. And I think another key word here of the last few years is pragmatism. Now, this word is thrown around a lot. It is not a doctrine in and of itself. It is not, I guess, not a principle of foreign policy in itself, but it's rather a lens or a tool that we use to view theories, principles, and approaches and ask the very important question of what can we actually realistically achieve and at what cost. Now, as someone who actually believes that the United States should look for ways to support freedom, to support democracy, to support the self-actualization of people and people kind of determining their own destinies, both individually and in their communities and in their countries, I think that should be a part of American foreign policy. But again, I don't see any contradiction between that and saying, okay, how can we realistically achieve that? I think we've seen over the past decade some very good examples of how we don't achieve that. We don't invade and occupy other countries and set up new governments and then leave people to figure it out. I would say, however, that those lessons, hard ones certainly for us, almost most definitely for the Iraqis, with estimates of well over 100,000 civilians killed over the course of the Iraq War. I think that this skepticism toward foreign interventions, certainly on the part of the American people, toward a large part of the American foreign policy establishment, though I don't know if it's yet large enough. I think one of the goals of this event is to expand that circle of people who see skepticism toward military intervention as an appropriate baseline. But I think that skepticism deserves to be put in the plus column of the Iraq War. There are very few benefits that the Iraq War provided, and one of them was we're just not super crazy about large-scale military interventions anymore, so I thank the neocons for that. Looking at Iraq and then turning to look to Iran, I think they are very, very useful, example and counterexample of how American power should be used. I don't want to overstate it, but I actually do think that Obama's Iraq policy has been a fairly judicious and effective use of American power. We're seeing the slow yet undeniable progress of a two-track policy, some elements of which were in place during the Bush administration, to be fair, but I think it's really important to recognize the extent to which Obama, when he came into office, made a point. And even before he came into office, let's remember, he started and won a pretty vigorous debate, even within his own party, with his Democratic Party opponent, Hillary Clinton, about the usefulness and appropriateness of engaging with enemies, specifically Iran, sitting down and talking with Iran, and advancing American security toward talking to our enemies. And I think he handily won that debate. I think the consensus was well on his side by the end of the campaign, with 5 former secretaries of state all endorsing his idea before Election Day. He took office and made clear both to the American people and to the Iranian people his goal was to reach out to try to find some new level of a relationship, try to overcome the tensions of the past decades. A huge challenge, no doubt. It was frustrating. There were rounds of talks that went nowhere. There was another round of sanctions, again, the most important and effective sanctions being ones that we were able to bring allies on board with us, European partners, both in terms of the UN and broader UN-backed sanctions, but also individually, the EU and other countries, countries like China, that even though, they're not going as far as maybe some people would like them to do, but they are taking very important steps in lessening their reliance on Iranian oil. Russia, I'm sure everyone here can have can have criticisms of what Russia's been doing. I would probably agree with them, but I don't think there's any doubt that the Iran issue has effectively been sort of siloed. The Iran negotiations have not been indexed to, U.S.-Russia tensions over Ukraine or other things, and I think that deserves to be recognized as a victory. So yeah, I can see, look at this counterexample. On the one hand, you had a massive military deployment, a military occupation, a destructive war, an expensive war. On the other hand, you have a recognition that it's in the United States' interest to prevent an Iranian nuclear weapon. Either for just some people would claim that Iran would use that. I don't find that very convincing. I think that's probably a minority view. It's somewhat more plausible that it would embolden them to act in destabilizing ways in the region. I also think there's reasons to doubt that, but I think it's a somewhat it's not an unreasonable claim. And then there's also the proliferation issue, the question of whether countries in the region would feel compelled, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey would feel compelled to obtain their own nuclear deterrent. So understanding that nuclear non-proliferation is in the United States' interests, that less nuclear weapons is better than more. I would say on the whole, even though we haven't reached the goal, we are on track, I think, to achieve something pretty significant for American security. And I think that agreement goes to what I would see as really, underpinning, something in the region that could be, and Obama has articulated this, others have articulated this, but I think the idea that Iran can be sort of encouraged, induced to be a more reasonable, responsible actor in the region. Now, they say and do things that I think give reasons for skepticism, but understanding Iran as a state with interests rather than a cause that's just going to act ideologically. I think if you looked at Iran's behavior over the past decades, Iran has had lots of opportunities to commit suicide to further its ideology. It has not taken those opportunities. I think it's very clear Iran acts in ways that preserve its own regime. It has interests that it sees as legitimate, and it pursues those interests. So the question is, and this is a bet Obama is making, is whether those interests can be brought within a broader framework, whether Iran can be, to use a foreign policy buzzword, a responsible stakeholder in the region. And I think the jury is still out. I think the move toward coordinating or talking to Iran over Iraq, formally, I should note, because we've been talking to Iran in various ways about Iraq for decades. I mean, that is actually one of the other pluses of the Iraq War, is that it caused the United States and Iran, put them in very close proximity, and we got to know each other in ways not always good, but not always bad, in which we simply hadn't before. So again, the jury's still out on this question of whether Iran can be brought into kind of a regional framework that adds to regional stability rather than regional instability. And in this way, Obama, this administration has really acted, over the protests of some of its closest allies and partners, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Israel, all of whom have problems for some of their own reasons, some different, some the same, who are made very nervous by the idea that the United States might be willing to see Iran and treat Iran as a more rational actor with legitimate goals and concerns in the region. So, I'll just finish up by noting, once again, how glad I am to be part of this conversation. It's one that I really hope continues, and we'll have more events and talk more. But as we talk, as progressives and conservatives, some of the views that we share about the role that the United States should play, the ways to use non-military tools to advance our security. But I'm really interested, and I hope to engage on this more. As again, speaking as a progressive, one of my root beliefs is, as I said about my, what I think about democracy and freedom. These should be a part of, the overall how we approach foreign policy. I do believe that we are in this together. It goes to, both my local community, my state, my country, but I think globally, I think that's something progressivism does bring to the table. So, but again, the question should always be, and I think this is where we'll all agree, is that the question is with what tools and at what cost. So I'll finish up there.
Thanks, Matt. Now, Dan Drezner.
Thanks. I'd also like to thank the American Prospect and the American Conservative for organizing this. I would particularly like to thank Maisie Allison, who I think literally actually would have moved mountains to get me here, and figuratively did move mountains. I also have a built-in excuse if any of this sounds incoherent. I came in on a red eye last night from Seattle, so I've gotten about 2 hours of sleep. So that's the reason this is incoherent. It's not my own not way of thinking about it. I've also been tasked to talk about sort of Asia-Pacific, Pacific Rim. And I want to talk about it both in terms of the economic side and the security side, because as Dan noted, I do have a new book out, and it does address this somewhat. If you take a look at what's happened sort of on the one hand on the global economy and on the other hand security in the Pacific sphere, you see two very discordant narratives since 2008. Because on the economic side, on the whole, the sort of institutions that were responsible for what you're supposed to do in the wake of a financial crisis actually worked surprisingly well. There were many excellent reasons to believe that the sort of great power concert and the institutions that they had created pre-2008 were going to crack up in the fall of 2008. And I'm old enough to remember when a lot of people were actually saying that in the fall of 2008. And yet that didn't happen. But you can't say that on the security side, specifically with respect to the Pacific Rim, and I want to sort of explore why. So on the economic side, there were a lot of fears that we were basically going to be revisiting the Great Depression. And you know that, that in the midst of an economic crisis, in some ways, crises metastasize into depressions the moment states sort of turn towards economic autarky. They decide to sort of eliminate economic openness. And that was why the Great Depression in some ways became the Great Depression. It was not just because of the stock market crisis in 1929, but it was in 1931 when there was a credit-on-stalled banking crisis and no one cooperated to help anyone else out, and in 1933 when the London Economic Conference collapsed due to U.S. unilateralism, among other reasons. But what happened after 2008 was very different. Most of the sort of key global public goods, think about it sort of WWKD, what would Kindleberger do? In terms of a crisis, most of them were provided. Markets for distressed goods were provided. There was no sort of real return to protectionism. The one thing that even skeptics of global governance post-2008 agree upon is that there was significant injections of liquidity in the international system. There was, by historical standards, a surprising degree of macroeconomic policy coordination. There was provision of exchange rate stability as well, despite a lot of very loose talk about currency wars. And international institutions actually functioned reasonably well, whether it was the case of the World Trade Organization or the IMF providing monitoring, or the G20 or other informal mechanisms providing a reassurance mechanism, or blunting domestic pressures for protectionism. And it also should be pointed out that on the economic side, the U.S. also acted like, a surprisingly confident leader. Whether you talk about the Federal Reserve engaging in a whole variety of both domestic actions and international actions in the form of currency swaps and opening up its lending window to European and Japanese banks, or the U.S. taking the lead in terms of IMF quota reform, and the only thing stopping that at this point is the United States Congress, or reforming the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision's rules or rules regulating sovereign wealth funds. So that, in fact, you're operating in a world where, in fact, the global economy has actually been surprisingly resilient post-2008, to the point now where actually people in the Fed and elsewhere are concerned not about market volatility, but the fact that markets seem way too calm in response to a lot of geopolitical shocks, which I find very amusing for a variety of reasons. But it does suggest that perhaps there's actually been more resiliency built into the system post-2008. It's almost like the system worked. I'm sorry, I'm shameless. On security, though, it's obviously a more disturbing message if you take a look at the Pacific Rim. If you take a look at sort of the broad indexes like the Global Peace Index or Human Security Report, you don't see a major spike in sort of instability and so forth. But there's been an undeniable ratcheting up of tensions in East Asia and in the Pacific Rim. You just rattle off South China Sea or East China Sea or North Korea and you get the point. And it's worth pointing out that international institutions here have actually been spectacularly unhelpful as these things go. The UN Security Council hasn't really done anything on this issue. The East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Regional Forum basically serve as a nice venue where the Chinese and the Americans can accuse each other of various hegemonic acts. ASEAN has been split by increasing crises as China was able to use Cambodia as a way to sort of provoke dissensus within that group. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, that it's adorable that people think that it will work, but it's not really going to work because China doesn't seem to want it. Indeed, China's interpretation of things like the exclusive economic zone are very much at variance with sort of traditional customary international law on this. And the U.S. response on security in the Pacific Rim also seems not necessarily more ham-handed, but less sure of itself. That on the one hand, there was the pivot, that started in the fall of 2010, and that was certainly embraced by a lot of countries in the region in response to various sort of perceived Chinese provocations in 2008 and 2009. Indeed, the pivot was embraced in some ways too warmly by some countries. You could argue that the pivot emboldened the Philippines, for example, to take a more bellicose position on Scarborough Shoal, which then led to the situation where the United States sort of had to say, well, we're not going to go to war necessarily over Scarborough Shoal. But the U.S. has actually committed to basically going to war over the Senkaku Islands, even though they don't recognize Japanese sovereignty over the Senkakus. They recognize that it's a disputed issue. But they have said that their alliance, we have said that our alliance commitment would get us into a war in that, should China actually challenge that. So, you can talk about two different narratives. Even realists that tend to argue the U.S. should retrench in various parts of the world, when you start asking them about China, they actually, their eyes start to light up because they do think, people like John Mearsheimer think that's really where the next big conflict is going to come from. But why is there such a discordant relationship between what's happened on the global economy side and what's happened on the security sphere, particularly in the Pacific Rim? And there's a good realist answer to this, which is if you take a look, at least in part of the distribution of power, you realize some very important facts. The first is that despite a lot of perception in this town, the U.S. still retains significant amounts of structural power, post-2008. Susan Strange wrote a great article back during the last debate about sort of waning U.S. hegemony in the late 80s, pointing out the various ways in which the U.S. still has structural power distinct from things like gross domestic product or economic growth or things like that. Military power, financial power, ownership of production, and production of ideas. On all four of these metrics, the United States still retains an overwhelming preponderance of power. The U.S. is still the military superpower. In terms of finance, the U.S. is actually a more central part of global financial networks now than we were before 2008, which is really extraordinary when you think about it, but nevertheless true. In terms of ownership of production as well, and production of ideas also, despite a lot of loose talk about challenging the Washington Consensus, what's striking is the absence of any really set countervailing ideas on that. On the other hand, what did happen is that traditional U.S. supporters, namely the European Union and Japan, were devastated as a result of the 2008 financial crisis, and really did suffer serious dramatic declines, in some cases because of policy own goals. And there's no need to go into details on this, but the important thing is that most sort of theories of hegemonic stability or hegemonic leadership, however you want to phrase it, tend to acknowledge at this point that, yeah, you want a leader, but leaders need supporters. Leaders need followers. It's not enough just to have one big state. And so what's happened is that in the wake of sort of waning European and Japanese power, you now have the rise of China as a great power, and China's done something interesting, which is with respect to the economy, to repeat something that Matt said, they've actually acted like a responsible stakeholder. They've actually done just about everything that you would have expected them to have done in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, ranging from provision of liquidity to eventually letting their currency appreciate to not engaging in sort of new bouts of protectionism. I'm not going to deny that they've certainly engaged in various acts of economic espionage, but that was a constant. That's not unique to a sort of post-2008 situation. So they've been perfectly willing to act as sort of, a supporter to the U.S.-created, what Bob Kagan used to refer to as the liberal economic order, for quite some time. On the other hand, when it comes to the security sphere, no, China's actually perfectly willing to act in a sort of newly assertive manner on a whole variety of things. And, you can argue about why they're doing this and the extent to which there's a reach. Is this because they actually care specifically about Chinese sovereign territory, and that's it? Or is it a case of they're just trying to get, influence over this sort of inner island chain with the idea that eventually they then want to expand their influence to the outer island chain? So the question is whether, on the Chinese side, whether they view this as a border issue or whether they view it as sort of the first step of what they see as regional hegemony. And here we come to an important point, and this might be a discordant note given this conference, but it's worth pointing out. There's a lot of debates about military intervention with the idea that if you use military power, that implies the use of force. In the Pacific Rim, I don't think it quite works as well there because there is a way in which the use of extended deterrence, meaning, pledging to commit to use force in case there is a conflict, has the potential to reduce conflict or reduce the actual use of force if it actually successfully deters another actor. So in the case of the Senkakus, it's fair to criticize the Obama administration for making that extended security commitment. On the other hand, it's also worth noting that China has responded to this by, let's say, focusing their energies a little more on the South China Sea than on the East China Sea. And so it's worth asking whether or not those sorts of actions do potentially act to tamp down actual great power war, even if it ratchets up tensions in the short term. But I do think the more interesting question to ask is that despite the sort of rising tension in the East China Sea and the South China Sea and so forth, there's not a lot of evidence that those tensions are actually affecting patterns of economic exchange. If you go back to sort of the pre-World War I era, which is sort of the last great era of globalization, one of the myths is that World War I broke out despite, large amounts of economic interdependence, and that shows the futility of economic interdependence as a constraint on state action. But if you actually take a look at the history, you start to see that, from 1890 on, states actually did start to take significant efforts to try to wean themselves off from economic interdependence. And it was actually the least interdependent states in the European system that wind up launching the Great War. And what's interesting is that sort of post, 2008, and even despite these recent tensions, there's been no real shift in either trade or finance suggesting that China or the United States or any other actor is trying to sort of divorce themselves from what they see as other security rivals. Indeed, what's striking is that despite the ratcheting up of tensions, there haven't been significant, moves in the way of geoeconomic responses. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, has not been accelerated because of Chinese actions. In fact, if anything, TPP has sort of slowed down to a crawl because of a variety of domestic issues. And by the way, it's also true in Europe. Edward Snowden's been far more of a brake on TTIP, for example, than the annexation of the Crimea has been an accelerant. So there are two ways to think about this. It's possible that this disconnect is temporary, and eventually we will start to see some sort of economic segmentation, which in some ways in and of itself is useful because it's a useful tripwire to sort of think about when are we actually shifting to a world where there are actually real great power tensions that could lead to a great power war. But you could also suggest a more heretical thought, which is maybe great power rivalry ain't what it used to be. Maybe we're operating in a case where, yeah, there's disputes over islands, and I don't mean to diminish that. But it's also possible that the great powers in the region recognize that it's actually not worth going to war over these things, and it's not worth sort of destroying the sort of global engine of prosperity to claim a bunch of coral reefs in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. Now, William Lind.
I'm Bill Lind with the American Conservative Magazine, and our thanks indeed to all of our sponsors once again for this opportunity. My message this morning is that too often foreign policy debates, particularly that between interventionism and what is intentionally misnamed isolationism, The United States only pursued a policy of isolationism for 3 years under President Thomas Jefferson, his embargo, which was such a disaster we have never done it again. That this debate, unfortunately, too often occurs in a vacuum. It occurs without reference to war. Obviously, foreign policy and war are intimately related in the real world because foreign policies often lead intentionally or unintentionally to war. The fact of the matter is that the choice between interventionism and a policy of a defensive grand strategy, which I'm going to talk about, is at this point not just a matter of, well, which one is nice. It's a matter of which one is consistent with where war is going. And war is at present undergoing the biggest change it has seen since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, with the rise of what I call fourth generation war. What the Peace of Westphalia did was give the state a monopoly on war. And we think of that automatically. States fight wars, okay. But before Westphalia, many different kinds of entities fought wars, not just states. The state, in fact, was a rather new thing at this point. Religions fought wars, races fought wars, tribes fought wars, business enterprises fought wars, dynasties fought wars, and they used many different means, not just formal armies and navies. The fourth generation means that the state is now losing the monopoly on war it established with Westphalia. Again, this is the biggest change in war in 350 years, and it is going to affect foreign policy. As the Israeli military historian Martin Ben Krefeld says, what changes with the fourth generation is not how war is fought, but who fights and what they fight for. And these are larger changes than changes in how war is fought. At the root of this change in war is a crisis of legitimacy of the state itself, a crisis which is present virtually everywhere, although it varies enormously in degree. But all over the world, including in the United States, a growing number of people are transferring their primary allegiance away from the state to, once again, a wide variety of other entities, to, again, tribes, ethnic groups, races, religions, sects, causes like animal rights, business enterprises, legal and illegal. Gangs are one of the principal elements in a fourth generation world. And the same young men who have no interest in fighting for the state are often very enthusiastic about fighting for their new primary loyalty. 4 times in recent years, in the last few decades, the United States military, which proclaims itself the greatest in the world, and certainly in terms of the amount of money spent on it, is the greatest in the world, has come up against fourth-generation non-state forces in Lebanon, in Somalia, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq. Those forces had no fighter planes, no tanks, no artillery, no body armor. They were armed primarily with rusty AK-47s and improvised bombs. And 4 times, they have defeated us. The measure of success in a fourth-generation situation is whether, when we or the other intervening great power leaves, we leave behind a real state. And in none of those cases were we able to do that. The pretense that we left behind a real state in Iraq has just dissolved within the past week. As we have seen historically over and over, a Vichy government and its hireling army disintegrates when faced with literally any opposition. This is a very profound change. And again, to try to carry out a debate on foreign policy without regard to the fact that our military can no longer win against forces which, by any measure of physical power, are incredibly weak compared to us. And if we graphed their resources on the same scale as our own, theirs wouldn't even be visible. The fact that our military and the militaries of other states, which are designed to fight other state militaries, cannot win against these non-state forces. This is a revolution, folks. This is an enormous change, and it changes virtually everything else. Now, when we look at foreign policy, obviously the first thing it says is an interventionist foreign policy guarantees failure, because you find yourself in a war with non-state forces, and the non-state forces beat you. So a pretty basic rule of foreign policy is you probably don't want to start wars you know you're going to lose. Too many foreign ministries over time have done that, but it certainly doesn't meet the conservative test of prudence. Another meaning, perhaps even more profound, because the foreign policy establishment utterly doesn't get it, is that you don't want to fight wars with other states. Why? Because the losing state's legitimacy, already shaky in many cases, will disintegrate, and with it, that state will disintegrate. We saw this, of course, with Libya. I warned before we started bombing Libya that the outcome would be the destruction of the Libyan state and another big victory for the fourth generation as Libya became a stateless entity. Well, surprise, guess what happened? If you go to war with another state, regardless of which state wins the war, we will lose, because the losing state will disintegrate and the real victor will be the forces of the fourth generation. Non-state forces will have another petri dish in which to breed and grow and from which they will spread. The distinction that will drive international relations in the remainder of this century is not some kindergarten level distinction between democracies or places that are free and dictatorships. It is between places that will be centers and sources of order and centers and sources of disorder. And when we go to war with another state, almost certainly the outcome will include the creation of another center and source of spreading disorder. Furthermore, when we intervene in these places, we will import the disorder here. It is not just that we fail to bring order to those places. When the root problem is a crisis of legitimacy, what chance do we have when we go in and create a government created by foreigners? What legitimacy is this going to have? Beyond that, we are going to import the disorder here. We will import it in the form of refugees. We will import it in the form of veterans coming back who have learned how to build things like IEDs, and some of whom will now be, among other things, gang members. Again, gangs are very important entities in fourth generation war. We will import it in the effects on the legitimacy of our own government of another policy failure, usually at very high cost, not only in money, but in lives. So the first rule of foreign policy at this point is don't go to war with other states. The second rule is don't go to war with non-state entities. Now, you put those two together, and it somewhat suggests that going to war isn't a terribly good idea. The absolute worst war we could get into, and there is a substantial element in Washington puffing the dragon to try to create this situation, is a war with China. We desperately need China to be a center and source of order. And it is naturally inclined that way because Confucian culture is naturally orderly. And supposed Red China is now paying a great deal more attention to Confucius than it does to Karl Marx. A defeated China could very well disintegrate into another period of warring states. What a catastrophe. 1 billion people, nuclear weapons, a lot of high technology, and it becomes an enormous source of disorder. We could not imagine a worse outcome. The Pentagon, of course, likes to puff the dragon because it's desperate for a symmetrical opponent, one it can say, well, we can beat these guys because they're like us. Yes, but what's the consequence if we do? And that's not asked. What we need, therefore, is a change in grand strategy. The largest change in war in 350 years cannot be accommodated with changes in tactics or weaponry or various other small things. It requires a very large change at a very high level, and that is a change in grand strategy. Specifically, we need to abandon the offensive grand strategy we have been following, particularly since the end of the Cold War, where we attempt to dictate to the rest of the world what their internal arrangements shall be and threaten them in a variety of ways, all of those ways weakening the state, by the way, if they do not become like us. The great conservative man of letters, Russell Kirk, rightly wrote, "There is no surer way to make a man your enemy than to tell him that you are going to remake him in your image for his own good." We need to return to the grand strategy that we followed successfully through almost all of our history, which is simply a defensive grand strategy. We don't go to war with other people unless they attack us. It's pretty simple. Their internal arrangements are their own business. We relate to the rest of the world very actively, but through non-governmental means, through trade and by serving as an example, not through playing the great power game with diplomacy and military force. It was said unfairly of Kaiser Wilhelm, and can be said fairly of the Washington establishment, that its worst nightmare is that there is a quarrel somewhere in the world in which we are not involved. The defensive grand strategy says those are other people's problems. We have these two wonderful oceans, east and west. They provide a lot of distance. We are going to use that distance, and yes, we are going to do everything in our power to isolate ourselves from disorder. Disorder means the disintegration of the state, and yes, that can happen here too. It is a very real possibility in this century that the American state will not survive it, particularly if it keeps engaging in failed wars. The defensive grand strategy served us extremely well. It cost very little. It made us popular worldwide. It gave the United States tremendous moral power, and as Colonel John Boyd argued, the moral level of war is the most powerful level. The physical level of war is the least powerful. And it is the policy, the grand strategy, that is in accord with the realities of the 21st century. The tragedy is that the Washington establishment will not see this, because it is made up primarily of people whose most important thing is their personal career. And if you are a member of the establishment and you suggest any change, you instantly cease to be a member of the establishment. So the question I will leave with you is, which falls first, the foreign policy establishment or the country?
Thank you. So we'll start with a few questions that I'll pose to the panelists, and then if we have a little bit of time at the end, we'll turn over some time for questions from you all here in the audience. And so since we've all touched on Iraq, or at least most of us have touched on Iraq and the recent developments there in our remarks, maybe we'll start with asking, is there anything that the U.S. could constructively do in response to the latest events, the advance of ISIS in Iraq? Or is it really the case that it's time to cut our losses and recognize that we don't know what we're doing in Iraq, we never have known, and we should not try to remedy a situation we don't know how to fix?
It was my understanding that there would be no math. No. No, yeah, a good question and a tough one. I think what we've seen over the past couple days, this idea, normalizing the idea that we are going to try and formally discuss the situation with Iran. I don't need to remind people here, Iran literally walked in there, behind the tracks of the U.S. tanks. They have a much broader and deeper understanding of Iraq than we do. And certainly their foreign policy, their national security policy over the past several decades was a raid toward preventing Iraq emerging as a threat after the 8-year Iran-Iraq war. So I think trying to work with them. I think what we're doing right now, saying to Maliki, listen, one of the roots of the problem here is that you're just not governing in an inclusive way. But the question is, listen, what tools do we have to actually make him do that? We couldn't do it with 100,000 troops in the country. The idea that we could have done it with 5,000 to 10,000 troops that we didn't leave, I think is kind of fantastical. So I think what we should do is, more of what we've been trying to do with Syria is, work with the surrounding countries to see how we contain it. Definitely try to work to deal with the refugee flows, because I think those are something that get more and more destabilizing down the road. But, at the end of the day, if the root problem, as I think a lot of people recognize here, is political, we unfortunately have very few tools to change that reality.
And well, would we be really in the best position to coordinate with Iraq's neighbors when our relations with several of them are quite bad?
Well, they're tense, and they're also working at cross purposes. It is. It's been stated. It's overstated. Let's state it again. It's a Cold War both between the Saudis and the Gulf states and Iran. It's in some ways a Cold War within the Sunni community, with much more kind of extreme Islamist elements, and then less extreme but Islamist elements. You've got the Muslim Brotherhood crowd. You've got the Saudis working against the Muslim Brotherhood and their allied organizations. So yeah, given all of these kind of cross-cutting conflicts, I think there is, again, the question is what tools, what influence does the United States really have? I think, continuing to stay engaged, and I think the idea that the Obama administration or the United States is pulling out of the region, I think is wildly overstated. But I do see it as a kind of right sizing of American interest in the region, because we do still have interest in the region. I think we do have an interest in doing whatever we can to prevent global jihadist organizations from creating small states here to plan whatever they would. But again, I'm sort of at a loss for what real steps we can take right now to change the reality.
Okay. Professor Barry Posen, who will be speaking in a few minutes, just had an article come out in Politico, I think last night, where he made the argument, the case for doing nothing in Iraq. Does that sound like something that's plausible for the U.S. to do? Do you think it's possible for the U.S. to refrain from some sort of activist response in the face of what's been happening there? Dan?
I was told that Matt was going to answer all the math questions, so no. I would say that, particularly with respect to the Middle East, what you probably want to do is eliminate what I would call the moral hazard problem for U.S. foreign policy, which is the notion that if, in fact, there is a deteriorating situation in terms of security that is unfolding there, that the U.S. will be the actor of first resort. And so I would say in that sense there is an incentive to not necessarily take immediate action, because in some ways this has a much more profound effect on Iran than it does on the United States. So there's not a bad argument. And here, this is also a question of what do you rank order threats to the United States? Do you think that ISIS having an actual safe zone of territory in which they can do whatever they want is a bigger problem than the Iranian state expanding its influence? And I think that's a debate that actually needs to take place. Or whether or not you think either of these things are actual threats to the United States also. But I do agree that I think there's something to be said for not doing nothing necessarily, but making it clear we are not doing anything unless we're acting in concert with others. We're not going to be, this is not going to be 2003, or not even 2003 again. This is not going to be any unilateral action by the United States. And in the end, if something bad happens in the region, you guys are going to be affected a heck of a lot worse than we are.
Bill, what are your thoughts?
Well, everything having to do with diplomacy, relations between states, etc., is completely irrelevant to what is happening in Iraq, in Syria, and in a growing portion of the Middle East. And it's going to be just like the 30 Years' War in Europe. And that is to our advantage. Because if you look at the demographics of this region, you see that it is filled with young men with no prospects, no jobs, and nothing to do. Well, what do young men do under those circumstances? They fight. This is supply-side war. You are going to have wars where you have those demographics. What we want to ensure is that we are isolated from the disorder that causes. The proper policy for us is to stand on the sidelines and say, fight fiercely, fellows, and let them absorb their energies with each other instead of directing them against us, which is what they do when we intervene in their region. We can't stop it. We benefit from it. And the single most important policy action we need to take is make sure we admit not one single refugee that will be fleeing by the millions from these conflicts. Because if they come here or to Europe, they will bring the same conflicts with them wherever they go.
Yeah, just a couple of points. One, on the moral hazard point, I think it's a very good one. I remember there was a few months ago when Saudi Arabia kind of was throwing its big temper tantrum over the U.S.-Iran rapprochement, or so-called rapprochement. There was I think it was, who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, Prince Turki, or one of the Saudi princes. You know, they had just withdrawn from the UN Human Rights Council, and he was, the op-ed said, if the United States continues to behave in this way, Saudi Arabia might have to start to, take action to deal with security in its own region in its own way. And this was intended as a threat, which I found really kind of interesting. The idea that they might have to act more.
The Saudi military is perhaps the most worthless in a region of worthless military.
Right. My point being, my first response was A, that'll be the day, and B, okay, what. I don't perceive that as a threat. That's actually kind of what we'd like you to start doing. But just to the point about, the Middle East, the 30 years war, I take your point. But again, I think this is where we may just have some difference. Clearly, the key concern of the United States government is the security of the United States, but I'm just not willing to kind of say that we should just stand back and let this region consume itself. I do feel that we, because what we're talking about when we're talking about letting these young men fight it out is massive instability, massive suffering, massive displacement. And I really am not willing to support a policy that just says, let's just stand back and let it burn out.
Problem is, nothing we can do will change it.
It's a fair point. I'm just not sure I completely agree.
Also, can I say that I think your theory that states as we know it are totally dissolving is a crock? I understand your argument with respect to certain states in the Middle East and perhaps sub-Saharan Africa, but telling me that the Iranian state, for example, is disintegrating, or the Israeli state is disintegrating, or a variety of other states, even in the Gulf region, are disintegrating, that I don't quite buy. So I'm worried that you're overgeneralizing a tendency in some parts of the globe where state borders were created in an artificial way and they didn't necessarily, you're right, they're not necessarily going to endure. But I'm not sure I buy this argument that this is a more general problem.
Well, as I said, the intensity of the problem, though it's present virtually everywhere, I'd probably say Switzerland is an exception, maybe Japan, a handful of others, the intensity varies greatly. However, the examples you give, first of all, Iran could very well break apart because the Iranians are only a relatively small portion of the population in Iran. The Iranians have important separatist movements going on. They are very concerned about those movements, and they are very much subject to the fourth-generation threat. As far as Israel, one of the things I learned when I went there was how incredibly bitter Israeli internal politics are. And to the point where I had a secular Israeli say to me, speaking of the Orthodox, we should put them in the kind of camps where they only come out the smokestacks. That's the bitterness of Israeli domestic politics. So I wouldn't be too quick as to say that fourth-generation war is just a problem in a few limited places where the state is particularly weak. It is cropping up everywhere, including here, where we have seen in recent years the interesting fact of the United States trying to bring order to Afghanistan, somewhere where nobody's ever been able to bring order, while being unable to maintain it 1,000 yards from the U.S. Capitol building after nightfall.
Well, I think we've got time maybe for one question from the audience. We're just about out of time. Does anyone, there should be mics there in the aisle for, yes, sir.
I've got a pretty loud voice.
Okay, please go ahead.
When I saw the title of this conference, New Internationalism, I was very hopeful
terms of, well, internationalism. Instead, I hear us talking in terms of the 400-year-old framework that Mr. Lind has talked about of competing nation states, the same framework that lies behind the United Nations. There's so many problems that the world faces that seem to require a global response. Shouldn't we be talking in terms of an internationalism that emphasizes globalism versus this old provincial national interest sort of discussion?
Anyone want to respond?
Sure, I'll take that. To have that kind of initiative that you're talking about requires, in some way, and here I'll agree with Bill, it requires a shift in identity. It requires that people think of themselves not as a citizen of the United States, but as a global citizen, or recognizing, you would need shifts in public opinion that would actually require people to think of this as a situation where, in fact, cooperation would be required. But in fact, you're not necessarily seeing that. In fact, if anything, you're seeing the reverse. Look at the European Union, for example. The European Union is in some ways the most ambitious project, that's existed to try to remake, national identities into something larger, a sort of European identity, or, the notion that there's not just Greeks or Italians or Spaniards, but rather this sort of European identity. If you take a look at the most recent Euro parliamentary elections, however, you discover the exact opposite has occurred. That essentially you've got, actors on the far left and the far right, both of which are incredibly xenophobic, at least outside, both within Europe's borders and outside of Europe's borders, doing relatively well. And in fact, the only place where that didn't happen is Germany, and that's because Germany's mildly insane policies that they've instituted across the rest of the Eurozone have served them well and served no one else well. So I think, unfortunately, you're still operating in a world where national identities or subnational identities trump any sort of sense of cosmopolitanism.
Just very briefly, I very much appreciate the question. Just from a political perspective, we recognize the American people are in a particular place right now, very skeptical of foreign interventions, and I like that as a kind of baseline. But that can change, and I think it's worth thinking about, if not simply trying to cultivate at some level, a sense of global citizenship, rather than just kind of saying, okay, what happens out there doesn't affect us, because in the event of another crisis, another attack, I think I can very easily imagine Americans being induced to support, maybe not this year, maybe not 5 years, maybe not 10 years, though I'd say within a decade, being induced again to support something really stupid. So I think it is worth thinking globally and to come up with a competing set of arguments for how U.S. security can be advanced through non-military global engagement.
I would just add that globalism and internationalism are zombies. They're walking dead. The sooner we bury them, the better. The elites have assumed that because they, starting with the League of Nations after World War I, transferred their allegiance away from the state to the international superstate, that eventually the rest of the bourgeoisie would do the same. In fact, people are transferring their loyalties away from the state, but it is to smaller, more concrete entities that actually have some content and that are worth fighting for, not to what is in effect Brave New World, which is what globalism really represents. And again, let's cheer that development.
All right, well, thank you all for your attention. Thank you to all the panelists. And we'll conclude this panel now, and we'll be moving on to the next part of our program, a talk by Professor Barry Posen in just a few minutes. Thank you.